Putin's New Russia. Before we begin our closer look at Putin, let's finish up the 1990s, the Yeltsin years, and consider the balance sheet. The winners, the losers, the gains, the losses. You can do a mental check-off of who wins, who loses. Women, workers, government, economy, foreign relations, societal relations, law and order, environment, military, the oligarchs. I want to spend a little bit of time of looking at what happens to the military in the Yeltsin years so we can understand what happens to it better in the Putin years. The military had always been the backbone of the Soviet Union. It was the pride of the revolution of 1917. The soldiers and sailors were to serve a superpower. But when the superpower collapses, the military also does. In 1998, military expenditure in real terms reached its lowest point, barely 1/4 of the Soviet Union's in 1991, and 2/5 of the level of 1992. And any effort of the 90s to reform was a failure. And the infrastructure, which had already been decaying, as we can see with the Chernobyl disaster, continued to rot away, whether it was the submarines, the docks, the buildings, and it makes it even scarier when we're talking about nukes. Overall, this was a time of humiliation for the armed forces. The men and women who had served in the Soviet army saw their army collapse and fade away, and there was no real desire then to continue on for many, but very little options to do anything else. One of the major issues of the 1990s was the proliferation of nuclear arms and the desire to try to remedy what could be an active black market sale in nuclear weapons. So there is an effort to try to deactivate the nuclear weapons, and the Soviets had stockpiled some estimated 40,000 nuclear warheads. It's very difficult to actually deal with all of this. You have to first find them, and then you need to dismantle them. And Russian facilities could only dismantle 2,000 warheads per year. There's also many unemployed from these nuclear industry, some 100,000 unemployed from these nuclear weapons installations that had access to nuclear technology. The Russia and United States diplomats quickly began to have talks to figure out what to do about all this, and it's a start. Start 1 was first ratified by Russia in 1992, and then in 1994, 3 former Soviet republics, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, signed START and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there were efforts to try to fix numbers on what these arms would look like, and the effort to create some kind of stability under arms control was then met with failure with START 2 when the State Duma in Russia refused to ratify it. And I think that's a signal that the State Duma then was going to want to get tougher on its perception of not being a forceful military power. It wants to rebuild. Another important issue that needs to be addressed and continues to need to be addressed is the radiation pollution. The radiation pollution is not a new thing, as we know with the Chernobyl disaster, and there had been other disasters prior to that. The world is suffering from radiation pollution, from discarding nuclear materials into the ground, at sea, from nuclear accidents, nuclear testing, and this remains ongoing. There's also heated debate over the rate and conditions for reduction of Russia's nuclear arsenal. So there's disagreement on what the military should look like. And this will be important when we look at what happens with the arrival of Putin onto the scene. The the Soviet Union collapses, the Soviet army collapses, and there's some effort to maybe privatize the industry. Yeltsin quickly realizes that this is maybe not the best idea, but even so, this was the military economy in complete collapse, as this quote sums it up, and I won't read it all, but just the beginning of it. With the end of the Cold War, Russian defense plants lost nearly 80% of their funding from the Russian government. So the military was yet another sort of casualty of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and because of this collapse of the defense plants and the defense industry, then the Putin era will be a time of rebuilding to try to make the Russian military great again. We're going to look at the Chechen Wars as a case study of this, of the deterioration of the Russian military under Yeltsin and the attempt to build it back up again under Putin. So first we've got to look at this map and realize, where does this war take place? Do you see that little red star down there? That's where the Chechen Wars take place, on the margins of the Russian Federation. There's an article that is posted by Williams on commemorating the deportation post-Soviet Chechnya, which I think does a wonderful job of setting the historical context of the war and its meaning and the memory. There is this sort of traditional view of the Caucasus that was developed in the 19th century as both sort of wild and savage, but also romanticized, that these mountain warriors had their own sort of set of values. They were authentic in their own way. And Lermontov's a hero of our time, and Leo Tolstoy's The Prisoner of the Caucasus sort of builds on this sort of romantic view, and both are very well worth reading, but particularly A Hero of Our Time is one of my favorites. This romanticized view of the mountain warrior of the Caucasus changes dramatically in the 20th century. And this is very evident with the Stalinist effort to remove the Chechens from their homeland and send them to Central Asia in cattle cars. And this form of ethnocide, then, is seen as a deciding factor for the Muslim militarization and leads to some of the hatred between first the Soviet Union and then the Russian state by the Chechen population. And I think it's interesting to note that the Soviet Union and then the Russian state create the terrorists that enact terrorism against them, so that the state essentially creates terror. The event is a journey of death and destruction, and again, read Williams for more of this. And this journey then provides this narrative, this ritualized narrative that frames the relationship between the Chechens and the Soviet Russians, that the Chechens are the David against the Goliath of Russia, and that because they have justice on their side, they will be redeemed. I think there's also a larger narrative in all this, too, is that the Soviet Union created many, many ethnic time bombs that explode with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we've already seen this, where all these post-Soviet civil wars that take place are in part because of this sort of fabricated, superficial brotherhood that had been created and then collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, what does it mean to be a Chechen? And again, Williams says that this journey of death and destruction, this attempt at ethnocide, is at the very core of the Chechen collective identity. And they've used this as sort of their chosen trauma to identify who they are and who their enemies are. And that this must always be remembered, never forgotten. Even though there was a relaxation during the thaw of the Khrushchev years where the Chechens were able to return home, when they returned home they encountered more misery, more outrages. So there's this narrative that the Chechen have in terms of their identity, which runs counter to the Soviet narrative, which is that the Chechens were collaborators with the Nazis, hence the need to remove them. And, there were maybe a few, but most of the Chechens were not collaborators, and many more served very honorably in the Red Army, but that's not in the history books. And to add another layer then of the Chechen identity being anti-Russian and anti-Soviet, another layer is added to it of this Muslim identity that becomes central to the Chechen identity vis-a-vis the Russians. So when the Soviet Union collapses, the Chechens seize the initiative, like many, throw Lenin in the river, like many, and declare independence from Russia, declare itself a republic in 1991, with General Dudayev as president. He's killed during the war, becomes a hero. Yeltsin is very unhappy with this, and so Yeltsin then declares in early days of December 1994 a peacemaking mission and sends in 40,000 Russian troops, and things go downhill from there. The street fighters take on the tanks and win. The tombstones are desecrated again, and if the Russian troops had known their history, they would know that they shouldn't have done that. That's how to make a Chechen really mad. Then in August 1996, the Chechens surprise the Russians in Grozny. They surround them, they trap them, and the Russians are forced to withdraw in November. Between 1994 and 1996, some 80 to 100,000 are dead, 4 times that number of the Afghanistan war. The responses and consequences are probably what you would imagine. Yeltsin's approval rating takes a huge nosedive. The January 1995 national poll shows an 80% disapproval of Yeltsin as president, 71% opposed the war. One of the most important NGOs that was created during the time of Gorbachev's Glasnost, a union of mothers of Russia, that had been very important in urging Gorbachev to withdraw forces from Afghanistan, takes on the cause of the Chechen War and calls on the human rights violations that are taking place. Grozny is in rubble, the villages are destroyed, refugees are teeming in, deaths of Russians and Chechens. So it's going to be up to Putin to then sort of rectify this humiliation, and he will do this. And we will see how then one of Putin's major tasks will be the revival of Russian military prestige. And he will tie this military prestige to his war on terrorism. And Putin will take a very tough stance. His popularity will increase because he's being tough. And the Second Chechen War, 1999 to 2000, is much more destructive than the first and will lead to essentially having Grozny as just a bombed-out shell. The start of the Second Chechen War is based on a pretext of the bombing of 3 Russian apartment buildings that are blamed on Chechen extremists, but there's a lot of controversy about this, so we'll look at this a little more later on. March 2000, Grozny is captured and destroyed. Extensive human rights violations and terrorism, of course, will pick up. Grozny was declared one of the most destroyed cities on Earth. And if this looks like a photograph that might be from Europe in World War II, I agree with you. But it's not. It's what happens to Grozny during the Second Chechen War. It's important to remember that creating martyrs is a risky business. A person could be considered a freedom fighter or a terrorist bandit. It depends on which side you're sitting on. Either way, an enemy was created. And combating Chechen terrorism becomes an essential platform for Putin's administration. It becomes a way to validate and to legitimize, in fact, many of his actions. And I think Williams offers some very interesting ideas of the Russian calculated destruction of Grozny versus the Chechen commemoration and the culture side of this. Probably one of the most appalling episodes that happens too after this is that under Putin, Grozny is rebuilt and renamed, and one of the main streets of Grozny is renamed Putin Street. Yes, Putin Avenue in Grozny, Chechen's capital's main street, is renamed Putin Avenue. The president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, dedicates the street to Putin in honor of his role as one of the world's